Well, I told you that there's a sermon I'm going to borrow. And it comes out of the preacher, is what he's called, the preacher, and his name was Solomon. And Solomon wrote a book. In fact, it uses the word preacher or teacher in the Hebrew, and it comes out of a Greek word, Ecclesiastes. And so we have the Old Testament book of the recorded sermon that the preacher gives to us about his experiences of trying to find out what the meaning of life was all about. So we read the words, the preacher, the son of David, king over Jerusalem. Now, the first thing I have to tell you this morning about this is that even though Solomon was the preacher and he was wise and he was rich and he was powerful, he was a king, the fact is there's a lot of ancient rabbis, there's a lot of church folk who didn't think that his sermon should be included in the Bible at all. In fact, they had determined that it shouldn't even be inspired in the Scripture, and those who eventually recognized the canon of Scripture have argued that they wouldn't even agree that they can't even figure out exactly what the message is out of this book. But I want us to look at this morning because I think we can begin to discover that there is a place for this in God's Word, and there is a reason, and the preacher himself gave us the purpose. So I want you to look at chapter 12. We're going to start toward the back of the book this morning, and here's what it says. Besides being wise, the preacher also taught the people knowledge, weighing and studying and arranging many proverbs with great care. So that was his purpose. The preacher sought to find words of delight. He spent some time trying to figure out how to say this. And uprightly, he wrote words of truth. And the words of the wise, now here's the picture, here's the illustration that the preacher used. They're like goads, or we might say cattle prods if you're from the farm, or we might say a stick. It was like sticks, or like nails firmly fixed, and our collected sayings, they are given by one shepherd. So he gives it to us, these pictures. Now what he's saying is that not only is it like the cattle prod that guides us to God, and it's not beating us, it's not pushing and shoving us, but it's simply guiding us when we get out of the path. But then it says it's like nails. The nails that you would nail on a fence post to keep the barbed wire in place or to put the boards in place to keep the livestock in. Not so to restrict us, but so that there are boundaries by which we can live our lives. And this is the tent pegs. Another picture would be the tent pegs. The tent pegs that hold down the tent so that when the wind blows, it doesn't just fly away. It's held into the ground. Now, the question is, what is the message of the book of Ecclesiastes? How did you get there? Well, we're going to discover the same way that some of you decide whether you go to a movie or whether you want to read the book or whether you want to invest in buying the book or whether you want to download the ebook. You'll go somewhere and you'll look at the trailer. You'll get a preview. You might go to Roger Ebert, and the movie critic, and find out what's going on. You may go to some page and decide whether it's suitable for your children and your family. Or you may go to the preface of the book and you open up the book and you read it. Or you may go to the last chapter or conclusion of the book and you get the review of the book, and then you decide whether you're going to read the book. Well, there's a trailer in the book of Ecclesiastes. And it begins in chapter 1. We get a preview in chapter 1, verse 2. And here's what the preacher says. Here's what he's going to talk about. Meaningless, says the preacher. Utterly meaningless. Everything is meaningless. Now, the King James puts that in a little more poetic fashion. Vanity of vanities. Everything is vanity. Everything is full of vanity. Now, aren't those awe-inspiring words? I mean, this is a TED Talk deal. Let's get the Post-it note, put that on the mirror every morning. You go to work. Everything you do today doesn't matter. It's meaningless, but go to work anyway. Sounds exciting, doesn't it? That would make you want to succeed. And that's exactly why some Bible scholars would say that this book that's given to us in Ecclesiastes has absolutely no relevancy because it doesn't talk about the New Testament. It doesn't talk about Christ. It doesn't talk about hope. It doesn't talk about anything that makes any sense. But let's take another look at that. Because here's what Paul wrote in Romans chapter 8. Romans chapter 8, verse 20, Paul said something that sounds a little bit like the preacher in Ecclesiastes. He said the whole creation is subject to vanity, or it's meaningless. Sounds like maybe Solomon and Paul kind of agreed with each other about what's going on in their lives. And then if you look at the summary review of the conclusion, here's what he says in chapter 12, verse 13. He says, now all has been heard. Here's the conclusion of the matter. Fear God, keep His commandments, for this is the whole duty of man, and God will bring every deed into judgment, including every hidden thing, whether it's good or evil. Well, that kind of fits what the whole Bible teaches, doesn't it? I mean, the Apostle Paul again says in 2 Corinthians chapter 5:10, we shall all stand before the judgment seat of Christ. We're going to all give an account. We're all going to give an account of the things that we've done in our body. So here we have it. Got it now? We got the preview trailer. Meaningless, meaningless. Everything is meaningless. Then we get this conclusion over here that says, fear God and keep His commandments. So what's the book about? Well, in the middle, we get this other theme. I want you to see if you can pick up this theme that goes all the way through the book. Let me give you a couple examples. Chapter 2, verse 24. A man can do nothing better than eat and drink and find satisfaction in his work. This too, I see, is from the hand of God. Chapter 3, verse 12. I know that there is nothing better for men to do with their hands, nothing more than we can do with our hands, than to eat and drink and find satisfaction in all this toil. This is the gift of God. Verse 22 of chapter 3. So I saw that there's nothing better for a man than to enjoy his work, because that's his lot. For who will bring him to see what will happen to him afterwards? Chapter 5, verse 18. He writes, then I realized that it is good and proper for a man to eat and drink and find satisfaction in his toilsome labor under the sun during the few days of life that God has given him. This is his lot. Chapter 8, verse 15. You catching it yet? Catching the theme? I commend the enjoyment of life, because nothing is better for a man under the sun than to eat and drink and be glad. Then joy will accompany him in the work of days of his life God has given him under the sun. And finally, chapter 9, verse 7. See if you get it. Is it beginning to come? Yeah? Beginning to show up? Go, eat your food with gladness, drink your wine with a joyful heart, for it's now that God favors what you do. Always be clothed in white, always anoint your head with oil, enjoy life with your wife, whom you've loved all the days of these meaningless life that God has given you under the sun. So now, let's put it all together. We have the preview, life is vain, life is futile, life is meaningless, and we have the conclusion, you better fear God and obey His commandments. And then we start picking up this theme all the way through it. Eat, drink, and be merry. Did you catch it? Now, how in the world do you put those things together in your life? How do we begin to put that together in our life? Is life even worth the living? And some of you would say, yeah, that's exactly what I'm talking about. It tells you that everything is meaningless. Then it says, go eat and drink and be merry and have a good time, but God's going to get you. You better obey His commandments, and He's looking over your shoulder, and you better watch how you party because God's going to get you, and He's giving you account. And it would be easy to see that when you're engaging in Ecclesiastes, where Solomon says, life isn't worth living, and if it is worth living, you got to always be watching over your shoulder. Now, what do we make of this? That may become understandable. And what I want to suggest to you this morning as you read the book of Ecclesiastes, that Solomon is not saying that life is not worth living. That's not what he's saying at all. When he says meaningless, 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 he's not saying life is not worth living. Here's what he's talking about. He's talking about the fact that there is a mystery in this life. There is a mystery in this life that no matter how hard you try, or where you go, or where you seek it out, or how intelligent you are, or how much money you spend, there is this mystery in life that you will never figure out this side of eternity. Look at chapter 3, verse 11. Again, God has made everything beautiful in its time. He has set eternity from beginning to end in the hearts of men. But catch this phrase. They cannot fathom. They can't figure it out. What God has done from the beginning to the end. You can't unlock it. God has made everything beautiful in our time. And so the problem is that when we start looking at that, God has put eternity in our hearts. But we can't see the end from the beginning. You know what it's like? You ever played with a Rubik's Cube? Rubik's Cube? I don't know if I can say that. You ever played with that? You know, the little colored squares, and you work through that, and now you can go on YouTube and it'll tell you exactly how to do it. But have you ever thought about if you were colorblind? How would you get those things to line up? And if you did get them to line up and you did everything they said, how would you know for sure that you're looking at it and it's the right way from your perspective? You wouldn't know if you didn't have the ability to see color. Even if you used all the algorithms and solved it, you couldn't be sure. That's the conclusion. Even if you were correct from your perspective, you couldn't be sure that you had got it together just right. And that's exactly what we find in chapter 7, verse 14. The preacher says, when times are good, be happy. When times are bad, consider, think about it. God has made one as well as the other, but a man, here it is, cannot discover anything about his future. So what does he say? Good times, enjoy them. In the bad times, think about what's important in your life. Think about the fact that life is futile and vain and meaningless, and you won't be able to put it all together, and no matter how hard you try. I've thought about it with my grandson when my children were younger. You remember, some of you do this with your toddlers. You've put locks on the cabinets that you don't want them to get into, where the toxic stuff is, or where they pull out everything that you don't want pulled out. And so you put the locks on them. Now, have you ever seen the toddler go over there and try to play that thing? He'll play with that thing and gets all frustrated with that thing. And he may even have enough sense to ask you to unlock. He wants you to unlock this cabinet and figure out this lock for him. Are you going to tell him how to unlock it? No. You don't want him to know that. And what's he going to do? He's going to get frustrated and he's going to throw a fit. Because you won't give him the mystery to the lock on the cabinet door. Some of us are like that with God. He won't give us the mystery to unlock everything so we can see it, and we throw a fit and get mad. It's kind of like the guy that I was talking to my brother the other day, an Italian who came from Italy a few months ago, and my brother went to his restaurant. He's opened up a cuisine in Great Bend, Kansas, of all places. And my brother was talking to him. He said, "How'd you get to Great Bend, Kansas?" He said, "Well, I was on the internet one day in Italy," and he said, "I just saw this banner that said, 'Great Bend, Kansas doesn't have any good Italian food.'" And on a whim, he decided to move to Great Bend, Kansas, and show them what good Italian food is. So my brother was talking to him. He said, "So how did that work?" He said, "You came across the ocean, left your family and everything." He said, "How did they think about it?" He said, "Well," he said, when I left Italy, the homeland, he said, Mama was crying. And my brother said, "Well, I suppose that's because she was going to miss you and was sad that you were leaving? He said, no, she didn't care at all that I was going. She was upset and crying because I was taking all the family recipes. There's some therapy right there in that family. We got a class for them. And so he came with all the family recipes to Great Bend, Kansas, and opened up this cuisine. Is he going to share with the general public all the recipe? No, he's not. Well, that's not fair. Is it true in Great Bend, Kansas, then, that everybody's going to boycott the restaurant and quit going because he won't share with them the secrets of the family recipes? Or are they going to flock into the place and say, we don't have to know the secrets of the mysteries of the recipes. We're just going to enjoy the fruit and the labor of what's provided to us? Well, you know what happened. I said, how many times you been there? And he said, well, in the last couple of weeks we've been there twice, and we're going back again. Why? Sometimes that's how we treat God. God doesn't show us the mystery. He doesn't unlock the cabinet. He doesn't give us the recipe. And we throw a fit and get mad. And sometimes we throw a fit and say, well, if that's the way it is going to be, then I'm not even going to acknowledge that you exist. In fact, I'm just going to pretend like you don't exist. And I don't want anything of you. I'll just take care of my own life. And I'll just enjoy what I can enjoy. And I don't need you. And so the preacher begins to give us all kinds of examples of people who do this in their lives. Watch this. Chapter 6, verse 1. He begins to talk about the mysteries that we can't figure out. He says, I've seen another evil under the sun, and it weighs heavily on men. God gives men wealth and possessions and honors so that he lacks nothing his heart desires. But then God doesn't enable him to enjoy them, and in the end, a stranger enjoys them instead. Let me call that this morning the inequity of hard work and reward. He works all of his life, and in the end, he doesn't get to enjoy his labors. Oh, Jesus told a story about that. He said there was a man who suddenly became quite wealthy. And he said to himself, oh, I'm going to build bigger barns, and I'm going to build a bigger house, and I'm going to get set for retirement, and I'm going to be enjoy all of my retirement with bigger barns, better things. And so he did. He built the bigger barns, he built the bigger house, and he said to himself, now I'm set for retirement, and I can sit down and enjoy what I have been able to get a hold of in life. And you know what Jesus said? Fool. Oh. Fool. Because that night, he died and left everything that he had worked so hard for to somebody else. Look at verse 11 in chapter 9. He talks about formulas that we have for success in this world. He says, the race is not to the swift or the battle to the strong, nor does food come to the wise or wealth to the brilliant or the favor to the learned. Time and chance happen to them all. Let's call that the inequity of success. You give everything you got, and you don't get anything back. I read about a man who went to lunch with an investor who'd been 20 or 30 years in the investment business, and he sat down to lunch with him, and he was hoping to get a few secrets, a little tidbits out of him to know how to invest. He was kind of moving toward retirement, and he wanted to know something about that. And so he sat down to lunch, and he asked him, over 20 years, what have you learned about investing? And here's what the investor said. He said, well, here's the summary of what I've learned. I've learned that some of the stupidest people in this city are among the wealthiest, and some of the shrewdest people have gone bankrupt. What was he saying? Solomon said that millennium ago. And then the preacher talks about the most difficult thing about the mystery of this life that we live. Look at chapter 2, verse 14. The wise man has his eyes in his head, while a fool walks in darkness. But I came to realize that the same fate overtakes them both. And I thought in my heart, the fate of the fool will overtake me also. What then do I gain by being wise? And I said it in my heart, this is meaningless. What is he talking about? The mystery of death. Now, most of you have lived long enough to know that death is a terrible planner. It doesn't have any respect for calendar or dates. It's never taken a time management course. And sometimes death is just purely cruel. Ever thought about that? Here's a young man, graduates second in his class in medical school in San Antonio, Texas. His parents, his wife, come to celebrate. Next day, he's going to Rhode Island for a choice residency. He leaves his wife, drives up to New England, and he's going through the state of Massachusetts, and he comes over a hill. And here's a truck stalled sideways, clear across the road. Slams into the truck, and everything's gone. His life, his parents' hopes, his dream, all of his hard work, all of his study, all of it is gone. While at the same place over here in the nursing home is a woman who's lost her mind, gone into dementia, doesn't know her relatives, doesn't know anything, and death seems to have lost her address. That's what Solomon's talking about. The mystery of death. And here's what he said. Chapter 2, verse 18. I hated all these things, and I toiled under the sun, because what I discovered is I must leave them to the one who comes after me, and who knows whether he will be a wise man or a fool, and yet he'll have control over all the work which I've poured my effort and skill under the sun. That's why I'm talking that this life is meaningless. So you go to business. You go to bed late. You get up early in the morning. You chase it every morning. You go after it. You work hard. You increase. God blesses it. You get what you dreamed of. You build it, and all the visions and the dreams and all of the time and energy and all of the TED Talks and all of the management principles and all the seminars, it pays off, and you strike it rich, and you get to the goal of your success. And then all of a sudden, you leave it. And you don't know if your kids are going to waste it. They're going to use it properly. You don't know who's going to get it. And I call that the mystery of the unprotected legacy. You give your whole life to something. Now, have you ever thought about this? Have you ever thought about this? Some of you have. Some of you live long enough. Some of you teenagers, you're just going, I really haven't given. Well, I hope you don't for a while. I hope you don't have to get too deep into this for a little while. But you need to think about it a little bit once in a while, because you're going to discover at some point in your life that life isn't everything that you had hoped or planned for it to be. And what are you going to do in those moments? I'll tell you what your peers are doing. Some of them are hitting this wall at some point and deciding the only way to get out of this whole mystery is death. Everything else is meaningless, and so death is the only answer because it gets me out of the meaninglessness. You don't have to be 65 years old to want to die. And it's not because the teenagers really want to die. It's because they don't see any future. And they've come to a dead end. Life is absolutely meaningless in their lives. The mystery of the unprotected legacy. I just talked to a middle-aged man the other day. We were talking about the deterioration of the body and how you get old and things don't work. And he was going through the litany of the organ recital that we talk about. And he said, but I've always got an option. I always got an option. I may just take myself out of this at some point. He's not a believer. And he was saying that to get a reaction out of me. And so I simply said to him, that's always an option. That's always an option. You could do that. And then he began to tell me that he talked to the Death to Dignity crowd. And it was pretty attractive to him. I'll just take myself out of this. Here's the problem. If you begin to try to unlock it and figure it out without God, it'll lead to a dead end. And in verse 5, here's what the preacher discovered. He took all these trips and he studied nature. And what he discovered in nature is he tried to find unlocking the mystery in nature. And he began to see that there are cycles in nature. And so he tried to find it in the cycles. Look at what he said. He said the sun rises, the sun sets, and hurries back to where it rises, and the wind blows to the south, and then it turns to the north, and it goes round and round and round and round, goes over, returning on its course. All the streams flow into the sea, yet the seas never full, and to the place the streams come from, they return again. Cycle of life in the circle. The Lion King, right? Circle of life. Hey. Some of us parents that tried to keep our kids from that because it had all that pagan stuff in it. There's some truth there. The preacher would have said there's some truth in that Lion King story. In the circle of life. So he tried to find the meaning of that. And so the cycle, all the rivulets and the streams and the rivers, great cycle. But he didn't find the explanation to the mystery. So then he turned to science. And he went and studied science. Verse 10, he says, is there anything of which one can say, look at this something new? There's nothing new under the sun. It was already here long ago. It's here long before our time. Let me say to you something this morning. See what you think about it. Scientists never make new discoveries. They don't discover anything new. They just make new discoveries. That's what I want to say. They never discover anything new. They just make new discoveries. Everything's been there from the beginning. That's why it's hilarious to me when we get into the science you start talking about, and people start talking like they found some new discovery. Right now we're doing this whole thing with climate change. The preacher says, the climate change stuff's been here forever. It's always been here. The science doesn't explain the mystery of all of this in our lives. And here we are, then we go to history, and he looked at history, and he said history is a great relay, and it doesn't really take us anywhere. And so people run the first lap, and they run the baton, and they pass it off, and then they run it to somebody else, and they pass the baton. And then finally you get down, and pretty soon you don't remember who started with the baton and what the purpose of the baton and the race was in the first place. History goes in circles. History can tell you what happened. Scientists can tell you how it happened, but none of them can tell you why it happened. The mystery. So the preacher said, I went to the philosophers and I went to the theologians. He said, I started studying with them. And he said, I came to the conclusion, chapter 1, verse 11. What is twisted cannot be straightened. What is lacking cannot be counted. For with what much wisdom there comes much sorrow. And the more knowledge you have, the more grief. Wise people know that the world is bankrupt. Wise people know that the more you know, the more you don't know. Have you lived long enough to figure out the longer I live, the less I know? I begin to realize that I don't know much of anything. And so we come down to this meaninglessness. Now, here's the question. Okay, so what's the use in living? Meaningless, fear God, can't even party without, what am I supposed to do? Eat, drink. What are we supposed to do with this life? Well, let me take you back to the preacher. Because all the way through this little theme, there's these little bubbling streams that keep bubbling up that represent his faith. What he believes about God. You won't catch it unless you really look at it really closely. But there's some conclusions that Solomon came to in the midst of the meaninglessness of life. Let me give them to you. The first one is this. He came to the conclusion that God is sovereign. God is sovereign. Look at chapter 3, verse 11 again. God has made everything beautiful in its time, and He sets eternity in the hearts of men, and you can't figure out what God, here's the sovereignty, you can't figure out what God has done from beginning to end. He's sovereign. What does that mean? It means he's in control. Well, what do you mean he's in control? If he's really in control, then why do policemen keep getting shot? Why do terrorists blow up buildings and self-blow up and go into malls? Why does God allow? If God is sovereign and in control, then why is all this junk going on in our world? Why don't he do something to stop it? Why don't he stop the rape of babies? For heaven's sake. Well, there's two ways you can look at sovereignty and control. Now, let me use this illustration over here. We have a soundboard. And this soundboard over here has all these knobs, and Eric is over here pretending that he's controlling it. Now, I noticed that he hasn't put his hand up. I've been watching him for a while. He hasn't put his hand up here on this board for quite a while. Now, Eric knows something about the mystery. It takes some talent and training to run this board. Because if you've ever been in a place where there was a sound technician who thought that running the board meant he had to control it and micromanage it, and he had to have his hand on a slide all the time, it'll drive you nuts. Up and down, squeal, you'll hear squeals, and we're trying to do, because they think they have to have something on there, have a hand on that all the time, and it drives the whole thing nuts. And there's some of you that want a God like that. You want him to suspend gravity when it's not in your favor. You want him to suspend the laws of nature when it's not in your favor. But you want him to be in your favor when it's in your favor. You want all the laws to work. It's just when you don't want them to work. And so you want God to have his hand micromanaging. Well, God doesn't control. That's not what it means to be sovereign. What it means is what Eric's been doing. Eric knows how this all works. He sees the big picture. He knows what's happening. And he also knows something that most of you don't know, but some Sundays in the last few weeks, I happen to know this because I'm on the inside track. Because he knows the big picture of this, he's able to control and work with this board even if there's a flaw, even if there's a wire that isn't working. And he has to bypass it and go to something else and hook something else up. And I saw him a while ago come over here and adjust something. I have no idea what that is today. But he's working through this big picture to get it to it. And most of us don't know even what's going on. But he works with all the flaws, and he works with all the differences, and he works with all the combinations and variations of what can go wrong. And he works with the board and allows it to do its function and its job without micromanaging it. That's what Solomon means and what the Bible means by a sovereign God. He doesn't micromanage everything in detail in your life. He leaves a lot of it to your free will and choice and to the process. But here's the point. He has the big picture. He knows where this is going, and he knows where you're going. And he knows where the process is, and he knows how you tick, and he knows what works in your life, and nothing is out of his influence, and nothing will stop him from getting to the goal of performing his will for the whole world, and it includes you. God is sovereign. It's beautiful detail, but there's another story here. And I have to tell you, there have been times, has this happened to you? There have been times when I climbed up over the wall of time and I saw what I'd been dreaming about coming together. It looked like it was coming together. I saw every piece in its place. It was just gorgeous. It was just perfect. Oh, God, thank you. This is so good. And through the fog, I could begin to see it. A well-prepared plan. And then something happened. We didn't break the glass ceiling. The floor fell out. What do you do then? I'll tell you how you do, what you do. You come back to the Apostle Paul who said the whole creation is meaningless and full of vanity. But you got to get to verse 28 in that chapter of Romans chapter 8, where it says that the sovereign God, even when everything has fallen apart and the floor has dropped out, the sovereign God is not surprised. He goes to work in the mess for good and for His glory. To who? To only those who are called according to His purpose and who love Him. If you don't love God and you've gotten mad and you ran off and left Him a long time ago and you aren't called according to your purpose, you're living your own life the way you want to do it and getting all the gusto you can suck out of it, then don't expect that you're going to be able to see that God is at work in the midst of the mess in your life. But God is sovereign. And that's what He tells us in His Word. And then there's a second thing the preacher learned. That God is good. Look at that again. Chapter 3, verse 12. I know that there's nothing better for men than to be happy and to do good while they live, that everyone may eat and drink and find satisfaction in his toil. Here it is. This is the gift of God. Chapter 5, verse 19 tells us again, He gives us the gift of gladness. God is good. What's the use of living? And sometimes you have to believe that because you're living in the cycles. Here's the preacher. He finishes one sermon on Sunday, and Monday it starts all over again. Some of you have cleaned house and you've cleaned everything spotless, and next week you got to do it all again. You've got to start all over again. You've been to your job and you've communicated to your employees or to your team 100 times what the procedures are, but they still don't get it. 6 weeks later, they're doing something else, and you got to tell them again, and then you got to tell them again, and then you got to communicate again. How many times do I have to tell you before you get it? About 10 more times. You understand the cycle. And yet this man says that the goodness of God is there in your work. Don't despise it. As frustrated as you are with your work, don't despise it. I don't know about you, but I've had days when I wasn't very busy. I can't remember them much. But I've had days when I was just overwhelmed with busyness. And I've had the times when there was no job and there wasn't employment and you didn't know what you were going to do next. Can I tell you that it's better to be overextended and busy than to have nothing to do? That's what Solomon says. In the frustration of your employment, you ought to get on your knees every day and thank God that you've got a job with all of its problems. That's better. God is good. But there's one last thing. The preacher concludes that God is not only sovereign, He's not only good, but He's just and holy. Why do we need to know that? So that we'll live responsibly. Look at chapter 12. Now all has been heard. Solomon's probably about 50 now. Here's the conclusion of the matter. Fear God, keep His commandments, for this is the whole duty of men and women. For God's going to bring every deed into judgment, including every hidden thing, whether it is good or evil. Here's the reality you and I don't want to face. We would prefer to do whatever we want to do, in any way we want to do it, without consequences and without anything. We want to pour all the toxic, sinful behavior of our lives into the river of goodness and then wonder why it's not good. We don't want any consequences. We don't want to be accountable. We want to be, like one theologian said, love God and do as you please. That's our motto for life. And yet the preacher says, careful, you will give an account. See, God is sovereign, and He's sovereign in good, but He's not stupid. He cannot be mocked. Whatsoever a man sows, that will he also reap. And God doesn't pay all of His bills on Saturday night, as one said. Sometimes it's delayed, and we think we're getting away with it. God is not weak or passive or indulging, and we have to understand that. So the preacher says, live life to the hilt. Live it with great abundance. Have fun, party, do whatever you enjoy it all, but live responsibly. Why? Because we're going to give an account to the Lord. And then the preacher speaks to the young people. He speaks to the teenagers in the crowd. Now, this is so counterculture because everybody knows you shouldn't trust or listen to anybody over 30. The preacher says, hey, kids, can I call you kids? Listen. Don't want you to have to think too deeply about this. Enjoy your life, but don't ignore it either. Look what he says in chapter 11, verse 9. Young people, teenagers, it's wonderful for you to be young. Enjoy every minute of it. Do everything you've wanted to do and take it all in. But remember, you're going to give an account to God for everything you do. So refuse to worry and keep your body healthy. Oh, wow. Keep your body healthy. Remember that youth with a whole life before you, if you don't do it with God, it's meaningless. Don't let the excitement of being young cause you to forget your Creator. Honor Him in your youth before you grow old and say life is not pleasant any longer. Now wait a minute, that doesn't fit, because what you're being told is, hey, go sow some wild oats, live it up, party. You can always come back to God. And some have, and I thank God for some of you that have made it back. But you know what? For everyone that's in this room who made it back from a wild party life, there are many who didn't. They're in eternity today without Christ. You don't know whether you'll get back or not. And so the preacher says, listen, honor God in your youth. And I stand before you today, and I don't brag because I'm a sinner saved by grace, and I could have been in the addictions at the deepest level, and I've lived long enough to know what those addictions probably would have been without Christ. But I can tell you this, I decided at a young age, as a teenager, that I was going to honor God with my life, and I wasn't going to listen to all those folks who said, go sow a wild life, you can always make it back. I just decided to honor God. You know what? I don't have the crazy stories about all the stupid, dangerous, nutty, sinful, ugly, messed up living that many people talk about. And I'm not ashamed of that. I'm grateful for God's mercy and grace. But I made a decision to do that. I said to myself, I don't have to experience what they experience in order for me to find out. I can learn from them. And I decided to do that as a teenager. And I gave my life to Christ, and I stayed with it. Now, I wasn't perfect, but I stayed with life for Christ, and I said no to a lot of stuff that many haven't. And you know what? I don't regret a bit of it. I didn't miss a thing. And the preacher says, I'm saying to you, remember in the days of your youth that you can be holy and just. Jesus said something in the same way. Chapter 10. He said, the thief is there to steal and to kill and destroy. That's right. The enemy will come and take your life. He'll take your youth. He'll take your energy, and he'll waste it with drugs. He'll waste it with all kinds of stuff and destroy the very good things that you've been given. But Jesus said, I've come that you can have real and eternal life, more and better life than you've ever dreamed of. I'm the good shepherd. The good shepherd puts the sheep before himself, sacrifices himself if necessary. That's where the meaning comes. Jesus says in the middle of the meaningless, I'm the way, I'm the truth, and the life. Without me, you can do nothing. There's nothing left if you don't do that. Somebody asked the second Mrs. Einstein whether she understood Professor Einstein's theory of relativity. You know what she said? She said, no, I don't have a clue. I don't understand nothing that he teaches. I don't understand the theory of relativity. But she said, I've come to understand Professor Einstein. And that's what God's Word says. You don't know all the mysteries of God. You can't know all the mysteries, but you can get to know Him. And He's sovereign. He's got it under control. He's good. And He's holy and just, and He loves you like crazy. And if you've wasted your life, hey, the cool thing is there is grace. You can have a second chance. He wants to forgive you. He wants to make a new change in your life. And though He doesn't give you all the answers of your life, He gives you Himself. And if you'll rise in that faith, here's what you'll discover. You can trust Him where you cannot trace His hand. You can step where you cannot see. And you will be able to undergo what you will never understand in this life. What's the use in living? Christ. He alone. The God who's sovereign, good, loves you, just and holy.